Hey guys, it's Patrick. Today I want to talk about my setup for grids. If you've booked with Houdini for a while, you know how useful grids are in your Houdini session. A lot of time you start with an empty grid, right? You don't just start with an empty grid and you don't tweak anything, right? I've already have something going on, but I just want to revert that to the default that Houdini uses. We know that once you change some stuff, it's highlighted and bold. Let's revert that, and this is our default grid. Most of the time we increase the divisions and usually kind of like 12 12 14 14, and you kind of want to start with a square, and you want to start with evenly spaced out things. So the frustration that I always had before I had this setup was that perhaps I want to do like 15 15, and then the grids get too big, right? The spacing is not what I want. Then you get like 20 20, and or perhaps 100 and 100, and then you get nice detail, that the level of density that you want before you can do a mountain SOP or something, right? And so on and so forth. So this is what you usually do, right? So it's given me enough grief over the years that I've come up with something, right? So the next thing that you want to make life easier for yourself is to just drag this thing in and do a channel reference. So see that the size X and the size Y, that's parameter names, right? And the size Y will follow size X. So now when you move and change the parameter, the width follows. What do they call it? Yeah, so the kind of width and height. So we all know that height is size Y, but yeah, so width and height. So the height follows the width. And the next thing is you see me do like 20, and then you have to go and do 20 for the other side. So using that same principle, we could drag that over here. So the other way to do that is right click and copy parameters and paste over the other side. So so you saw me drag relative channel that does exactly the same thing. Now when you change this guy, you change the other side as well. Okay, so changing, you realize that we're doing two things. One thing is the size, and then the grid density no longer makes sense. Then I have to react and do that as a corrective action, isn't it? What we want to do is kind of link them together as a function of each other, so it reacts to each other. So I'm just kind of walking you through the steps that led me to the final form of that setup. So gonna delete the parameters and reset to default. So if you use it enough, you'll know that delete channels control shift left mouse button, and to reset it to the default, it would be control middle click. This one, revert to default, which is control middle click. So control middle click, when I do a control middle click on something that already has an expression, I need to control shift left mouse to delete the channel. So control shift left mouse, control shift left mouse. So, and then you control middle click, so they revert back to their defaults. Okay, so we're back to our default, and what we did was if I wanted to do a square, I would do a relative channel reference so that it listens to this, and then relative channel reference so that columns listen to rows, right? And that's all good and dandy. Remember, we want to kind of have a relationship between the rows and the size. So what happens is if I drag this over, that's the relative, right? So that it means that when the size is 10, right, the rows there'll be also 10 rows, which corresponds to about the 1 unit, right? So 10 units deep and wide, then you get 10 divisions there, right? So should be 5 by 5, 10 divisions, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So the reason why it's not corresponding to that grid is because there are the 10 segments, but in order to have 10 segments, we have 9 lines. By right, it should be 11, which is plus 1. So you get like 11 sections, and then you get 10 lines, and then the lines would match with the grid. But let's, for the sake of simplicity, 10, 10, right? So then in this way, if I increase it right by integers, you'll see that the size now corresponds exactly to the same amount that I have. And if I start increasing it by decimal, you know that the number of rows is an integer. It cannot be 21.5 rows. So that's going to snap to the nearest integer. So it waits until it's kind of 22, and then you'll see it increased by a whole number, something like that. Okay, so what we've set up, the density is the same, right? The density of the grids. What if I want doubly dense than what we see here? So that's a bit limiting, right? You see me add 1 to this, right? Then it's kind of 16 rows plus 1. Okay, so that was like 16 rows plus for so it's using 17. So if I use 16 as a whole number, you'll see that 16 plus 1 is 17. So it's always one step ahead of whatever the size is. Similarly, if I didn't want to use that now it's back to 16, 16. If I want double the density, right, I can do a times 2. And you'll see that for 16, you'll see 32 rows, and then the columns will reflect that. So okay, so we still have that same behavior, and that's doubling. Wouldn't it be good if I had another parameter, right? This, you see me kind of, we call that hard coding, right? The number 2, where did it come from? I have to go inside and adjust the expression before the number of the density can change. So this one is the density, isn't it? So if we do a times 0, not minus 0, but it's multiplied by 0, you get nothing because you at least have to have 2. Okay, if I do a times 0 plus 2, what happens is it will negate everything is 0, and then you plus a 2, so you get one face. So you at least have to, so if you plus a 1, the row is 1, you have no faces. But if you plus 2, you'll see 2. Why did I say this guy evaluates first? Because multiplications always get evaluated before addition and subtraction. To make it clear, you could do this, but yeah, that's what Houdini is doing anyway when it evaluates any expressions mathematically. So this one, okay, so let's say times 1. So we want to offset and outsource, right, this guy to another parameter. So how we do this would be aim for this cog icon, right, and click edit parameter, this one, interface. Okay, so you'll see we want to do between divs per unit and rows. So where's that? So this is a reflection of how this entire menu is created. So that's a good thing for us because it means that we have access to the same tools to be able to modify, and it exposes that to us, which is very good. The density, we want to use a float, okay, and grab the divisions per unit, which is here, and rows, right? So I want to slot it in the middle. So that's called the density. For a lack of a better word, you can call it whatever you want. I used to have huge confusion between these two. So this one is the internal name, the variable as we call it, and this is the label and whatever appears here in a readable form. So you see that one is lowercase and then the other one is uppercase. Perfectly okay for you to just copy and paste and use exactly the same name, as long as you understand what it is. So hit apply, you'll see it update, and you'll see that density, right? And when you mouse over, you'll see that the parameter name is called density X and Y. Unfortunately for us, we actually wanted one number, right? But it had density X and density Y. I'm going to delete this. You can just hit select this. If you click it again, you can rename it, but select this. This is our custom one, right? And hit delete key on your keyboard, and you can just go to float and pull it in again, and make sure to drop it between divs and this one. And this is again one value again. Hit apply. You'll see that becomes, right, one value with a slider. Then we can go and replace the name like how it used to be. Hit apply. You will see it update here. There is a default value when you return to default, which is this one, revert to default. We know that when you times 0, nothing, right? You need to be at least, so we give it a default, like maybe that you saw that we multiply by 1, it was okay. So I want my default value not to be 0 but to be 1. So I select this density parameter, and you'll see that the default value is found here. Channels. So the default value is 1. When you do that and hit apply, you'll see the default change to 1. And when you change it from any other thing other than 1, you'll see it bold to be thicker, the font. So delete, revert to default. You'll see it go back to 1. Now instead of this 1, you have to read from density, and following that same naming convention here, parameter name is called density with the lowercase. So I'll go and do a ch channel density and close. When you click that, you don't see any change, but it's actually doing 14, right? So it's following this multiplied by 1. So now if you density times 2, you will see it do a multiply by 2. And then now you can control the density, right? And let's say I want a size like that, and when I change the dimensions of my grid, you'll see that it tries and keep that density. And if I like this is almost like twice. For every unit you have 2 of these, right? So then when you change, you'll see that here for every square unit you'll still have about, you can fit about 2 of the resulting density of the grid. The question is, what if I don't want a square, right? So right now it's kind of, this guy is equals to this, so whatever change in value drives this guy, and whatever change in this value also drives the row, and the columns are looking exactly at this first value. And then the column is listening to rows, so in actual fact it's only one value that's driving. So this is width and this is the height. So the width is driving the height, the width is driving the rows and columns, and is driving the row, and then the row in turn drives the column. So it's just one value, and everything works out for itself. Going one more step, which is the final form of my setup, I want to give it an aspect ratio. That means width versus height, so that we can have a non-square thing going on, right? Just like this density, I wish that there was another thing that could allow me to push to have a different height. Let's say this guy is now directly looking at the same value for the X, but if I Control Shift and left click, right, I break the connection. Let's say I do 20. Let's make it even more drastic, like let's say 40. You will see that our setup breaks because 40 is the height, and you still have the same number of columns for 40. Column corresponds to the size X, and row corresponds to the size Y. You have to visualize and go around to their way of thinking. Rows are a number of horizontal lines, and the columns are vertical lines, right? Like columns of a building. 40, right, affects the height, right? How long this guy is. So that affects the number of rows. Something like that. Now we have to have a relationship between this value and number of rows, right? Before that, it's kind of one value drives everything because it was a square. But now, if it's no longer a square, this guy have to be the other way. Instead of following size X, right? We know that rows is related to 28. So I'm going to copy this, and then now for this guy, I want to say size X, and this is size Y. So what happens is, like we explained, right? Size X is here, which is the number of columns, how many lines this column is. And the size Y is the horizontal lines. So when you do that, right? So undo and redo. Okay, you'll see that size X, right? The number of columns is now following the horizontal number of lines we have in horizontally, and then size Y, right? Even if I make it very, very thin, you'll see that it's still doing that density. So so that it keeps it square. So in this manner, you can make any kind of, you can make a strip, or you can make it really, really thin, and you'll still get the resolution that you want. I have another setup that have another parameter, like I mentioned just now, where there's an aspect ratio. That means it's width versus height. That means if I have 42, right, and in this one I want it to be half of this kind of, right, so I can drag this over and say, well, that was our square function, right? So if I do a times 0.5, so that's half, you will see that when this guy moves, this guy always remains a relationship of half. So if I do 20, this guy will get 10, and if I do 9, this guy will get 4.5, which is half. So what's it good for? Sometimes you want to get a grid that fills up your resolution, for example 1920 by 1080, right? So if the resolution is you know that 1920 by 1080 is 1.778, so 1920 by 1080, there's an aspect ratio, and that's the multiplier 1.778. So if I do a, right, 1080, so that's for the width, I can get back times 1.778, I can get 1920. That describes the relationship between the width and height. So if I get that divided by 1.778, I actually get a 16:9 ratio that fits into, if I now create a camera, that is the aspect ratio. The camera is, this looks to be not 190 by 1080, but if I put 1080, you'll see that this size never changes. 1080, it's the same, it's just half of that number. But if I change it to something else, like you'll see that this aspect ratio changed. This is 4:3, so 4 units by 3 units. So it's closer to a square, but 1080. So with whatever we've set up, divided by 1.7778, you'll see that I'm able to, if I move the camera with me, I'm able to match exactly that aspect ratio, because it is 1920 by 1080. Okay, and that's good for kind of a image plane at the back, right? So that's exactly fills up the exact screen. So that's the relationship between that, if you want to go for that. So if you want to go for this, what you can do is now set up an aspect ratio. So you can do a aspect ratio would be after the size, right? So here, ratio, and you'll see that when you hit apply, you'll have that space here. That's because the label says so. And then internally, it's being called aspect ratio with a uppercase R. You tend to see that Houdini names its stuff all lowercase. To be compliant with that, I might do that. Or you can do AR, whatever, standing for aspect ratio, but that's kind of just too short for my liking. So aspect ratio, whatever, just make it readable, and so that you can understand it 2 years down the road, say. So if I do this, you'll be divided by, and I want to see CH aspect ratio. Okay, so the aspect ratio by default is 0, so I want it to be by default 1, and hit apply. You'll see that by default is 1:1. It means that it's a square. For every unit of size X, I get the same unit of size Y. So now if I do 1.7778, I'll get back to that aspect ratio that we had. So that aspect ratio now drives, right? Now drives the second one. So with a setup like that, you can easily just break it and then give it whatever value you want. Or you can put back the expression and then be controlled by this. So if the relationship between this and this is important to you, you can put this aspect ratio here, right? Or without that, you can just freely link the first value to the second and then have another expression, or you can just explicitly enter 2 values inside. But the main thing that I want to make convenient for myself is to have a density, and then no matter what size it is, the density stays the same. It helps me keep the density of each section. I hope this has been helpful to you, and you'll find some way to use this to make your life better. I'm going to put this setup, and I'll put in one version with the aspect ratio one, and the other version without the aspect ratio, and I'm going to put it there as a Houdini file so that you guys can take a look at it or just use it straight away on ArtStation, and I'll put the link in the description. Yeah. So if you find it to be helpful, send me a message. Thanks for watching this, and I'll see you next time.